Well, hello everybody. This is Molly Gordon. Welcome to the April 2015 Wholeness Hangout. My guests today are Zach and Craig Polsfuss. And Craig was my guest back in January. We talked about neuroscience and spirituality and psychology. Zach has worked with Craig. Zach is Craig's son. In both realms, and I'm really looking forward to exploring more about the principles behind the human experience and the neuroscience related to what in the one phrase is higher brain living. And I thought I'd start with just some really brief introductions. Most of you know who I am. I'm a coach and a seeker and a human being. I've been coaching since 1996, and I came across the teachings of Sydney Banks in, I think it was about 2009, through the coach Michael Neal, and have been studying Sid's work ever since. Sid had an enlightenment experience which he articulated in terms of three fundamental principles of mind, consciousness, and thought. I will let Craig introduce himself and then Zach introduce himself, and we'll dive in. Craig, hi there.
Hi there. Thanks. It's good to be back again. This is so fun.
Yeah, welcome.
And to bring my eldest son. Let's see. I'll make this quick. It seems like as far back as I can remember, I always had this thirst to understand what life was, who I was, and to optimize the value of that and the experience of that. And that led me into psychology and spiritual studies. And I had my life-changing awakening at age 28, which is when a little bit before when Zach was actually born. And that's prior to even hearing the principles, which was a few years later. I described that experience as when my life turned inside out. And ever since then, I've been on a mission to understand and experience and live in that more, as well as then just bring the best of that to people. That love just expands to everyone and everything, and you better not ignore that. Otherwise, you'll not have the life you were made for. So then, Zach's born, grows up in an environment of that understanding, and then the three principles. That was like 1981-ish, somewhere in there. I met Sid Banks and some of the early teachers. I think I was about among the first 25 psychologists that ever heard about this, and I immediately saw the value because it jived with what I had understood and experienced, and gave me a language that I love. To me, the three principles is the most articulate, profound, simple language for the ultimate understanding in life. Now, I'll take an opportunity here to kind of create the context of that'll help this discussion we're going to have. So to me, those three understandings are absolutely life-changing. And it's not just a language. Those understandings actually direct you into more of that understanding, more of that wisdom, that health, that consciousness, that joy, all the things we're made for. But what I realized a few years ago when I came into this neuroscience higher brain living program is that there's a physiological, neurological correlate to all this. And we'd even talked about this. There was a conference years ago at the University of West Virginia for three principles, where we talked about these things and discovered how the brain creates certain chemicals that correlate with that wonderful feeling we have when we learn the three principles. So when I saw that and saw a physiological technique that opens that channel and tunes the brain in to the very thing that three principles are about, well, they just correlated there. So as part of my history, I'm creating that context that led me now to being a three principles teacher, and for those who are interested, I do online teaching and coaching related to that. But in addition to that, I'm a higher brain living facilitator and can provide extra information and certification information if people get interested and think, you know, I might like to learn this and help other people with this as well as whatever, in addition to whatever you're doing. You can contact me, and I know the contact information will be later.
Yeah.
So that was probably too long, but that's a quick introduction from me.
Great. Well, welcome, Craig. It's good to have you on board.
Thanks.
And Zach, hey there.
Hi.
How are you?
Very good. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
As set up by my father, I am my father's son. My name is Zach. And just briefly kind of where I'm coming from in my life and the path I was on. Growing up with a father like Craig, like you just heard, and growing up with a extremely intelligent and pragmatic mother, I just felt very free to be able to explore who exactly I was and not have things kind of forced upon me. And so on that journey at a very early age, I started devouring quantum physics books, books on consciousness. Sydney Banks, I've seen him probably 6, 7 times live, starting at around that age. And the main impetus for me going into my full discovery of the 3 principles was that my father had always kind of displayed the qualities of that, but he had never outwardly said, you need to know these things, you need to learn this. And it was actually my brother who had committed a small crime, which he was mandated by a court to do an anger management class, and he went to my dad thinking he could get out of it very easily by saying, well, can I go to one of your 3 principles conference things, and that'll count as my anger management class. And my dad said, sure, but you have to do it for me to sign off on it. And so at this point in my brother's life, he was very confrontational with my dad. They didn't get along too well because he was very rebellious. He was at that stage in his life. And he goes to this conference that my dad does and comes back, and he looks at me and he goes, Dad, I thought that was going to be something that it really wasn't. He goes, Dad really knows what he's talking about. And I'm like, what? And he's like, it changed my life. And I'm like, are you serious? And so I said, I got to figure out what changed your, because Sam was just not in that avenue. And so I went and I learned basically a vocabulary around what I had always kind of felt and known and seen displayed in front of me, which was really valuable. And it helped me propel forward in my life in much healthier and more positive ways. And it helped me gain and glean a really good articulation of existence. And I knew it could profoundly help people. And so it was one of the tools in my tool bag, so to speak, because it really does explain everything. But you can't just jump right into explaining everything for people. Sometimes you have to maneuver around it. And so, but I was always aware of an evolutionary drive in myself that settling for a certain amount of information or understanding was never enough for me. I always knew there was more, that this entire thing called life has a directionality to it, that it is going somewhere. And so I surrendered to that and kept looking for more and more and more. It's like this beautiful thirst that when it gets quenched, you find a whole new thirst that you never knew about after that. And that's, I've realized that's the very thing that makes us alive. And so that led me on the path to find higher brain living, and that profoundly changed my life and actually gave me and this is going to sound funky and we can talk about it, a true understanding of what Sid Banks meant by the 3 principles and what he labeled them as: mind, consciousness, and thought. Prior to an experience I had with higher brain living, I had formulated a feeling and an idea of what I thought those 3 things meant. But then I had an experience where I tangibly accessed that formless dimension of ourselves, and it changed the rules of the game and the definitions for me of those things. And so now we're here and having this wonderful interview, and I can't wait to talk more about these things.
Great, great. So for people who are new to this conversation, I'd like to just give a real brief introduction to the what of the principles. And as you indicated, Zach, there are layers of understanding and meaning attached to these. So I'm just going to give the merest snippet and invite both of you to chime in to elaborate. But what Sid saw is that, first of all, he says these three principles are really aspects of one principle. It's a unified reality that he's describing. But he talks about mind, or the infinite formless energy that's behind all things, out of which everything arises, that animates everything. And then consciousness, that which is aware, that which brings our experience to life. And thought, the moment-to-moment mental activities, which includes all mental activity, extending to feelings, emotions, somatic sensations, that we experience life moment to moment via thought, brought to life by consciousness, animated by mind. That's my very rough beginning. Jump in and I'm particularly curious, Zach, you talked about growing up kind of in the soup of this, where it wasn't said explicitly, but this was the backdrop to your growing up. And I'm curious about what it was that you kind of understood, what your background understanding was of life.
Of the three principles, or of life?
Well, of life.
Well, you know, growing up in that environment, my dad, you know, so we would get upset with something, and I would say, this feels unjust, I don't like this, or something like that, in more childish language than that. and he would respond with, well, you can think whatever you want to. Right? And it was those kinds of things and interactions that would almost reflect that understanding and make you look at yourself, even at a young age, because it was like, well, I can think whatever I want. You're right. And that was, as you grow up with that constantly reflected back at you, you start to go, wait a minute. Am I my thinking? I get to control even the content of my thinking if I want to. And so it started to change the rules of the game. But prior to the three principles and growing up in that environment, from a very young age, I was very aware, and this is the best way to describe this. When I looked out into the physical or manifest world, the material world, I was never able, and am still not able, to fully subscribe to what I am seeing as a solidified fact, or that it is absolutely real. And so there was just something in me that was like, this is changeable, this can be whatever we want it to be, and what I am seeing does not mean it's the truth or fact. And so I just started really querying that part of me and investigating that. And that led me on my life's journey and up to this moment, basically.
Okay, great. Craig, you want to jump in with anything at this point? I'll mute that phone.
No, yeah, answer the phone. There were other, it was probably, I'm sure if we talked more, Zach would remember moments where there were other ways I quote unquote taught, whether it was just spontaneous or intentional, that did not involve language, like, oh, you can think whatever you want. It would involve sometimes, I remember one time when I had grounded him for something, or not grounded, had him time out on a chair, okay? the little kid, did something he wasn't supposed to, and then talk to him now and about why, help him understand why shouldn't you do that, and he said, yeah, okay, yeah, and he got it, and I thought, okay, got it, and you're not going to do that again, right, and then I don't know, later that day, next day, deja vu, I look, there he is doing the same thing again, exactly what he'd gotten timed out for. So I said, Zach, and he kind of, oh God, I got caught. So he comes and he's, and my thought is, time him out again. The whole, you've got to be a consistent parent, all that kind of thinking. But my instinct, my wisdom, my feeling was saying no. So I stopped and I listened to that. And I realized that wasn't the way to go in the moment, but I didn't know the way to go. So I was kind of in that reflective, open, I don't know, but I want to. And what occurs to me is I'm standing there and he's like up to my waist or a little higher. He's that tall, and it occurs to me, geez, I'm towering over him. So it just felt right to get down on my knees, and we were eye to eye then. So I just got down on my knees. And in the meantime, I'm thinking he's sitting there quaking, kind of like, what's going to happen? Not that I was a brutal parent, but, he's got caught.
Right.
And then I'm just like, I see he's quaking, and my heart goes out to him, and I go, and my feeling was to just go, you know what? Just hug him. So I just put my arms around him, and I hugged him. And I felt, and then it was kind of like, now it's time to stop, and it was like, no, it wasn't. I just hugged him, and I realized I was holding him until he calmed down and wasn't in that anymore. And then we were just there, and I realized as I was just being with him, hugging him, waiting to see, well, what am I going to say to him? How do I be a good parent here? That, not only was I quieting down, right, into quiet mind, but I was helping him do the same. And it started to occur to me, that's probably all we need. And so then there we are, and I remember the point came where then I just kind of separated, and I looked at him. He looked at me, and we were both good. We were both calm. And I don't know if I even said anything, or if I did, it might have been, you good or something? And he went, yeah. And then we went on our way, and to my knowledge, he never did that again. He never did the thing that I was disciplining him for again.
Mm-hmm.
Now, knowing him, he might have found a clever way to do it anyway. But, I didn't sit there and go, you can think it's okay to do that, but you could change your thinking. That's why I never explicitly sat them down and went, you should learn this, and this is what you should learn. It just never felt right. And then there came those moments where, they seemed ready, I offered, and they took advantage of it.
What it sounds like to me is that as a parent, living with the understanding that experience is created from the inside out, that was both sometimes a message you would explicitly give the kids, that you have a choice about what you think, or you're thinking and thus you're experiencing things. And other times it was implicit in your recognition of how they're producing their experience, or your recognition of what happens when any of us settles down and connects with our wisdom and with each other.
Right.
Yeah. It's intriguing to me in my work as a coach. Sometimes I explicitly teach the principles to a client, but often we're just having conversations about life.
Yes.
And swapping stories about life. And it's the implicit messages about how we experience life that sometimes seem to give people the most leverage over their experience.
Right. And the energetic or feeling exchange that when it's on track, as a coach, I get energized by whatever I hear from my client, and it brings something up in me, and then I flow with that and share that, and then it does that for them. And it's like this upward spiral of going somewhere better, more understanding, more awakening, more sinking into that feeling of health and beauty in life and centeredness, higher consciousness.
Right. So I have an idea about how we might walk through this conversation, and I'll throw it out. It occurs to me we've got kind of a foundation about how it was to have the principles understanding as kind of an implicit, a background to growing up for you, Zach. And then you went and you actually heard Sid, and so I thought it might be nice to hear from you. And I'm in the background as I'm thinking this, I'm thinking too of that evolutionary drive, that something in us that seems to want to continue to learn and wake up and grow. So I thought we might look at what changed or unfolded for you, Zach, when you heard Sid, and then take the next step, what changed and unfolded for you when you had the higher brain living experience. Does that sound like a plan?
Sure.
Great. So tell us about hearing Sid and what shifted or opened up for you when you heard Sid.
Sure. Well, when I started listening to Sid, it was back in the days of tape. And so my dad had a lot and still has a lot of tapes of Sid. In fact, he probably has the largest collection on earth, I swear. And what I first noticed is his thick accent. Yeah. And the way that he talked. He had this uncanny ability to put you in the quiet mind state just by him talking. And what I was first aware of is that most people are not in a quiet mind state. And when they are close to that quiet mind state, the only thing they've ever associated it with is falling asleep. Because there's no chatter, and the only time there's really no chatter is right before we drift off to sleep. And so that level of quiet mind, that really actual quiet mind, most people associate with sleep, and so did I. And so when I started hearing Sid, I would literally start to fall asleep in the crowd or fall asleep listening to the tapes, which I bet is a lot of other people feel the same way.
Yeah, I have heard that from other people.
Right, and it's because I just came to realize that the quiet mind state, just because I associate it with sleep does not mean I have to fall asleep while in that experience in that state. We can cultivate a level of conscious awareness, and in fact high states of conscious awareness in that state. And so that's where it really shifted for me. And hearing him talk, you know how it is when you hear anybody talk about the three principles. They're kind of beating around a bush. And it's like they're circling a truth, a formless truth, that they can't necessarily say directly or point at directly, but they're doing their best to tighten that circle around that formless truth. And so I realized that, and so I just investigated that further in my own life. And as I did, it just began to change everything. Your interaction with other people, your interaction with yourself and your own thinking. And it just puts you in just much more positive states. But the one thing behind it all is that I always was aware that no matter how much understanding I gleaned, or how much truth and contentment and peace that I attained, there was always something in me, a spark, a fire that said, this is awesome, but there's always more. There's always more. And so that's what led me to not only stay with the three principles and deepen my understanding of that, but start looking for other things that were available in the world as well. And in fact, if there was a possibility of me plugging any of these things in as a full-time career to feed me not only intellectually but at my soul level and at my formless dimension self, that's what I wanted to do. And so that led me down a path of discovering higher brain living.
Okay.
Maybe I could jump in here for a second, because I don't know, maybe it's obvious, I have that same thirst or spark in me, which relates to him. So that's when along my radar, I'm a three principles pioneer. I mean, I'm published in professional journals. This is the basis of my life and my work since I found out about it. And I'm not looking to add anything, but when across my radar came higher brain living, there was something about it that captured my attention and spoke to that spark in me that said, pay attention. So I did. I've learned to be attuned to that and honor that. So I did. I thought, there's something different about this. And when I went and heard about it, not only was it philosophically completely in alignment with the three principles, but it had this amazing physiological technique that shifts the brain's physiology, opens that channel that correlates with higher consciousness, and it just physiologically opens it. So I went, and Zach was supposed to go to that with me, but work got in the way, so he wasn't there. I come out after that meeting, and the first thing I do is I get on the phone to him, and I said, what I just saw is amazing. You've got to see this. And he goes, what is it? And I said, I can't explain it. And he goes, try. So apparently I went on for 10 minutes, but he says in the first 2 minutes he got it and was interested, and then just had to endure me going on for 8 more minutes. But and then he acted on the spark there, and I suppose Zach could take it from there if there's more to the story, but I just wanted to bring in how that spark works in our lives. I've never, on the one hand, I felt like preserving the integrity of the three principles is absolutely essential, but also understanding in reality the integrity of the three principles is not just language or quote-unquote understandings. Those can evolve and be open, so true mind, true ultimate intelligence can bring all kinds of gifts into your life on all kinds of levels, and be open to it, even if it's going to turn your thinking upside down. Be open to it, because it's mind's gift to you and your gift to yourself.
Yeah. And, I wonder if this would be a good time to share that short animation. What do you guys think?
Oh, sure.
Does that make sense? I've got folks I'm going to share my screen. Let me get this set up here. A short animation that demonstrates what we're talking about.
Science says we only use 5 to 10% of our brain's potential. Why? Here's the short answer. The lower brain hijacks energy, blood flow, oxygen, and metabolism from the higher brain, where our high-end potential lies. Why does the lower brain do this? The lower brain is trying to help us survive, but it sees everything as a problem.
Sorry about that.
Maybe are you trying to make it full screen?
Yeah, is it full screen?
It's not for me, and it's gray and white, and it's not easy to hear.
Okay.
If you could maybe get the mic closer to the speaker. Well, if people, I know you're going to put up my contact information later. If people want this little, it's under 2 minutes, this little overview of the higher brain living, I can send that to them too.
Hold on a second.
Yeah, maybe you can get it to work.
Yeah, let me try it one more time. I think I see what was going wrong. Let me just try one setting. And sound default, save, go back to screen share.
It's where you feel empowered. Science says we only use 5 to 10% of our brain's potential. Why?
How's that?
Here's the short answer. The lower brain screen, blood flow, it's not that bright. And it would be good, I think, if you could start it over one more time so people could hear from the beginning.
I'll give it
one more try.
Actually, if it doesn't work on 2, I'm going to let that go. Okay. I'm sorry, folks. I will post a link to this. It's about a 2-minute animation, and I just don't want to belabor you with settings. It was a nice idea. Zach, maybe you'd like to give a shot at explaining what it was that we would have seen.
Well, what that little video is it's kind of just explaining an overview of what higher brain living is. And like I said, I just kept looking for other things, because there's just a drive in all of us. It's what makes us wake up in the morning. I mean, it's what makes us go live our days. There's this drive, this spark, this forward movement built into everything around us, including ourselves. And so when he told me about higher brain living, I was like, all right, I got to go see what it is. You're kind of not explaining that well. Because he had just seen it and he did not have the verbiage around it really solidified. And so what I did is I went and saw a presentation by Dr. Michael Cotton, the founder, and in a nutshell, what higher brain living is it's a gentle touch technique done on the body that causes a surge of energy, blood flow, and metabolism to go to the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And higher brain living refers to that portion of the brain as the higher brain. And the reason that's important is that the higher brain is the least used portion of our brain currently, and it's responsible for our highest states of being and access to the highest levels of consciousness that we can access as individuals and collectively as a species. And so people who go through the higher brain living system literally awaken to an entirely new perspective and state of being and state of consciousness that becomes permanent for them over time, because he's actually, through this technique, affecting physiological change in the brain, which is really revolutionary because it was completely organic. And it wasn't electrodes or a pill or some weird thing. It was built into our system, almost innate wisdom and intelligence in there that built an energy system to be able to energize this really evolved part of our brain, which I was fascinated by. The other thing I saw when I saw this was there's this amazingly mind-blowing involuntary breath and movement response that happens in every single person when their prefrontal cortex turns on. And so now let's go back to my story. Seating myself in the three principles understanding and moving forward from there, basically knowing the principles of existence and the principles of experience. I view this higher brain living technique and I see something I've never seen before, i.e. that involuntary response. And through the three principles, obviously everyone knows that we cultivate an area in ourselves for innate wisdom and innate intelligence and innate health to usher forth and inform us. And so as I had cultivated that prior to seeing higher brain living. And so as I am watching this demonstration, I have an innate response, and people will call that innate wisdom their intuition or something like that. I had a response that I would call coming from my heart, and my heart said, you have to learn how to do this. This is revolutionary, and it has massive ramifications for yourself and mankind. And immediately my brain, because I was not looking to shift careers or anything, goes, wait a minute, what? No. No. Slow down a second. And isn't that just kind of how everybody, I think, is pretty much aware of the two kinds of thinking that we do, that innately wise, that intuitive or heart-centered space, and then the logical, analytical, figure-it-out kind of thinking. And so I knew through previous experiences in my life that if your heart tells you to do something and it tells you to do it very loudly, you had better do it, because it somehow taps into your innate truth, the truth of who you are authentically at the deepest levels. And your mind, not understanding that dimension of yourself, because the mind is in our head, our logical mind is of the world of form or material existence, it can't venture into that formless dimension, and so it knows nothing of it, but the heart does. That innate wisdom does. It comes from that dimension. And so I learned I had to follow that. And so I overrode my mind, and it was kind of easy to do just because of all the quantum physics stuff I had read in my life. It had allowed my brain to understand that literally anything is possible. And if you do any amount of study on quantum physics, you'll find that out pretty quickly, that literally anything is possible in the material world, which it still blows my mind. And so my heart has always known that, and so I followed that, signed up for Higher Brain Living training, and started receiving these sessions. And it was within the first 4 sessions of receiving these, turning on the prefrontal cortex, that I had an experience that I now understand. And at the time, I had to move through it, but it was an experience akin to what Sid experienced when he discovered the 3 principles. And so I can stop for a moment here, but that's kind of the story of this and an explanation of it.
Okay, so one of the things I'm curious about is the relationship of the physical, and the spiritual, and the physical, and the difference between well, I guess one way to ask the question is, can a physical experience cause a spiritual experience?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And this is one of the most exciting understandings that's emerging right now in the world. And that is, old schools of thought and old understandings were that there is 2 dimensions of existence, basically. You have the formless dimension, which is literally without form. That means not even thought is in there, because thought is form. And that's basically what Sid plunged into, this formless dimension that he called mind. And then later, he extrapolated that out into 3 principles, mind, consciousness, and thought. But initially, he called it mind. And that formless dimension can be labeled as the spiritual dimension of existence, I think is what you're asking. When people access that part of themselves, that's when they say, I've had a spiritual experience.
Right.
Then there's the world of form. And historically, they've been viewed as these 2 worlds. And that you can plunge into this formless or spiritual dimension, and then you're back in the material world or tangible existence. Well, the newest understanding that we have found and gleaned is that those 2 worlds are in fact only one world. They are 2 sides of the exact same coin. You cannot have one without the other. They are systematically and intrinsically linked together. And so when you say, this leads us to this understanding of for every formless dimensional experience that we have, there is a physiological correlate in the material world.
Right.
So being 2 sides of the same coin, if something happens on this side, it affects this side. And vice versa. If something happens on this side, it affects this side. And so, yes, there is a path biologically to a spiritual experience. But they're both sides of the same coin. So they're one and the same. So vice versa, if you have a spiritual experience, something tangibly is happening in the world of form, and they've found that through EEG studies on extremely high consciousness monks, that when they go into these high formless dimension experiences, something is happening in the material world as well, and that is changes in their brain. So that led us to this amazing understanding.
So there's a correlation when something happens. I guess the distinction I'm looking at is correlation and causation, that things are co-arising as opposed to causing each other. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm a firm believer in that they are co-arising, because and that's what's unique about this school of understanding, is that those aren't 2 separate things. So one isn't causing the other. They're one thing happening. That's it. It's just one thing happening, but it appears in two dimensions to us, the formless and the form. But that's actually one thing.
Right.
And so there is no cause from one to the other. That's what's so interesting. There's schools of thought in the West that believe the brain creates consciousness. And then there's schools of thought in the East that it's consciousness that creates the brain, or mind that creates the brain. And it's neither. Both are correct. One is just the correlate to the other. The material world, this is what's so revolutionary and so exciting. This understanding frees us and changes the context and the rules of the game. These two worlds are interwoven and are in fact one world. And the underlying principles that govern that whole thing are the three principles, and the understanding that it's all going somewhere, that there's directionality to it. We are in a constantly evolving formless and form system. That we are not, and this is what we're taking it in some amazing realms here, we are not separate from that. We are not riding this forward directionality. We are, in fact, implicit in it. We are it. We are the actual movement forward of existence, formless and formed. Yeah. And the more we seat ourselves in the understanding of the three principles, the more we allow the formless dimension, which is innately wise, innately healthy, to imbue and pour itself into and inform the world of form. And that changes the rules of the game, because the content of our mind, i.e. thought, then gets upgraded and is informed and produced by the world, the formless dimension of ourselves.
So I think you went somewhere really important and made a big step there when you said that this experience then feeds back into changing and upgrading the content of our thinking.
Yes, absolutely. It happened for Sid. When somebody plunges into a spiritual or formless dimension experience, there are effects and ramifications in the material world. And one of those is that when you hit higher states of knowing, because when you plunge into the formless dimension, we're not dealing with belief at that point. And we're not dealing with strong feeling or faith. We're dealing with, you plunge into a realm of absolute knowledge and knowing. And then you come back to the material world and have to somehow take a formless knowledge and then build it into form, i.e. content of thought. And so that thought content, by default, because you've accessed a higher state of formless dimension, a high spiritual experience, the content will be of higher and more positive value by default. And so you want to jump in, Dad, and kind of give your thoughts on this?
No, I'm enjoying this. I'm loving the. Can you see the passion and the clarity and the flow that's just being expressed there?
Right.
Yeah. Sid. Language is challenging. Sid pointed to this. He said the form and the formless are two sides of the same. In two things in disguise. It's the same thing in two disguises that way. Or he talked about how the oneness, and so we can't ignore. And at the same time, he did say the mind energizes the brain, and that doesn't mean the mind causes the brain. The brain is the mind in form.
Right.
Everything is mind in form. Everything is consciousness in form. Everything is thought in form.
Well, it occurs to me that the upgrading can happen in two dimensions.
Yes.
In the realm of form, the greater the capacity, integrity, health of the container, that's going to affect how the formless is expressed and embodied.
That's right. Or same thing, or received. When Sid had his experience, he talked about it. He was shrouded in light. and there was this buzzing sound, and of course this amazing feeling. Well, that's obviously there's something going on in the brain there, right? I mean, and that correlates with a lot of what we're talking about.
Right, and it would be in error to use reductionistic thinking to say it is only the biological or formed world that is the path, or only the formless dimension that is the path, when they are the same thing.
Right, right. Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah.
So that's good stuff. Go ahead, Craig.
Well, I just thought it would be cool to have Zach. I just love the way he describes, like, when he had his experience, this big shift after a few higher brain living sessions, I was there in the room, and I saw what was happening. I had this big grin on my face because I knew it was big. And he gets up, and he kind of comes over and is kind of disoriented, actually, and sits next to me, and he's just like, oh, my God, wow. And then I don't know how, right away or a few minutes into it, I said, well, because I could tell he was trying to integrate it. And I said, well, how would you understand this if you thought about it in terms of the principles? And Sid, and his eyes lit up. He grabbed a sheet of paper and he just started writing and writing and writing. And then he shared how it all began to gel for him. And I think if Zach could share that, that would be wonderful.
Zach, you up for that?
Sure. Well, so what happened is I was having a higher brain living session in a room with a lot of other people having this type of higher brain living session at the training itself. And I'm not going to go into the details of the tangible aspects of what was happening, but I came to a crossroads internally in my mind that was being facilitated by a new part of my brain turning on, where I had to choose to go to the part of my mind, or personal mind I now know, that was screaming for me to stay with it, or I had to fully surrender and turn my attention to a much quieter but much stronger voice that was that formless dimension informing innate wisdom part of myself at a level I had never experienced, quite honestly. And what I did is I made a cognitive decision to turn all of my consciousness to the voice of the innate wisdom, which plunged me into a formless dimension experience that I literally cannot explain because words are form. And I was in this place for what seemed like a quite extended period of time, and when I came back to the material world, I had a level of knowledge and understanding that I could never have dreamed of in 1,000 lifetimes. And so the issue with coming back to the world of form was that all of that knowledge and understanding is inherently formless. And in order to create thinking or a thought or an idea about it or communication about it, you have to somehow fit formless dimension experience down and distill it down into a thought and then thinking and then an idea and then communication, which I found very challenging quite quickly. And
Right.
in fact, I sat there without being able to communicate for 45 minutes to an hour. And then my dad said, you know, think about it in terms of the three principles, or something to that effect, or how would Sid, like, is it something about Sid? And I went, all of the language of the three principles immediately flooded into my experience in that moment, and it gave me all of the language I needed to be able to explain something that utterly cannot be explained. And it was, and in fact, as I've looked back into Sid's work and his talks and stuff, it was Sid's earlier stuff that I was much more resonating with, when he was talking about thought being all things, not just the thought being in your, thought is literally all things, all. When he says all, he means all. I mean all.
Go figure.
All things that are of the material world. Thought, feeling, emotion, the material world in front of me, it's all thought. And he said that. And another thing he said is God. What is God in motion. And when you accept what is, you're accepting God. And so the most accurate description of the place I went is the word is. There is an eternal isness that is the base of every single person and all of existence. There is an isness that has no beginning and no end, and it's infinitely, in fact, the word infinite is confining for what that space really is. And it's this powerfully strong isness that has this infinite level of wisdom and intelligence. And what I realized, and I'm just going to kind of go through real quickly the revelations that I had that can change people's lives. I realized that when Sid said it's all thought, when I had the experience of this place, I realized it's literally all thought. And so thought in your mind is the actual first catalyst to have the world of form be in existence. And so very quickly I started going through every single thing I had ever held dear in thought. Any idea, any system of thinking, any feeling that was attached to my thinking around that specific subject or definition. And I'll give you an example. The word love. I had cultivated my entire life through experience and through deduction and reasoning what I thought love was. And I had attached feelings to it and definitions to it, and I thought I really knew what love was. Well, then I have this experience, and I come back, and not only is my entire lifetime of content around that word not true, but it's actually irrelevant to the true understanding and experience of love. And so what that did for me is it was extremely confronting, but at the same time extremely freeing, because I realized there's a quote in the Bible where he says, God says, "Thou shalt put no false idol, thou shalt not worship a false idol." I realized that every single thing in the world of form, including our feelings and our thinking, that we've cultivated over time is nothing but a false idol that we've been worshiping by giving conscious attention to it. And that the actual truth is behind what we've labeled as the definition or the... And so for me, the most confronting part was realizing that everything I had cultivated prior to that experience was not only not true, but it was totally irrelevant to the grand scheme, truth, and knowledge of that experience.
Exactly.
And so it was so freeing for me to be able to move into a space where I can, the way I describe it is that your thoughts, your ideas, your feelings are all castles in the sand. And it doesn't mean that building castles in the sand doesn't have profound meaning and purpose, because it does.
Right.
But always seating yourself and knowing that it's all castles in the sand and eventually the tide will wash it away. It allows you to approach life in a completely different space. And so that was one of the most, and you can chime in here.
I want to jump in because I know we're running out of time. Could you quickly share the insight you had about the nature of the thought coming into your head when it's personal and impersonal, because that's profound.
the other thing that, yeah, then I was going to get to that. The other thing beyond that that was that I realized is we have this idea of God, and everybody has attached words to what God means and given him a voice or her a voice or a feeling or something, right? And various things have been used to describe that. And I had always cultivated this idea of what I thought if God were to speak to me, what that would sound or feel like, and it would, and of course you think it would be very, very apparent, and you would know it immediately, right? God is speaking to me. Well, what I realized that there's an informing nature. Now let's think about that word, information, formed from within. There is an informing mind that is the base of all things formless and formed. Now, the personal mind lives in the world of form. It is not in the formless dimension. And so when I turned my attention to that other voice and plunged into that experience, I had the revelation that that voice that was now informing me, and the reason I knew it was mind was because tangible or material world didn't exist. It came the same way my personal thought did, and it felt almost identical to my personal thought. But because the material world did not exist in any way, shape, or form, I knew that it was formless dimension mind. Because if it was any thought, the formed world would exist because thought is form. So there would be form to it, and there was no form. So what I realized and what I know now is we all have constant access to mind, or the formless dimension wisdom. And one of the errors I had made, which now it seems so obvious, that formless dimension, or what I'll call for me, God, speaks to me constantly in my mind. It comes the same way thought does, and it speaks to me in my voice. And so I now know I constantly have access to, and there's a river of innate knowing and wisdom flowing through my mind at all times. I just mistakenly thought it would be very different than my personal thought, and it is in many ways because it's informed. But the personal mind, it has the same tone, the same voice, and it feels the same way. Almost. There's a subtle difference, and that's what Sid meant by you're searching for a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
The feel of that informed mind content feels different.
Right, right. There's so much that is the same, and yet there is that sense, what the still small voice, as some writers have said. You know, we're right up on time. I want to make sure to put up a slide real quick that gives contact information. So I'm going to do this screen share thing one more time, but without any animation. How's that look? We see, I hope you're seeing higherbrainliving.com. Are you guys seeing that?
Yep.
And the phone number, Craig, this is where people can reach you. Is that correct?
Yes.
And Craig's email address, we decided to keep it simple and just give you one email address. You can always reach Zach through this website or through Craig. And now I'll go back to...
Connect with me about 3 principles and higher brain living, and we're particularly interested in speaking to people who feel attracted to higher brain living to maybe become trained as facilitators, because this is a way that we're able to reach people with an amazing gift, and we're teaching the 3 principles through it. I've taught the 3 principles at facilitator training the last 2 years for the facilitators, and they totally love it.
That's great. So I'll stop. And I just want to thank Craig Polsfuss and Zach Polsfuss. You guys have been great. We could go on all morning for this. I really appreciate your time. I thank everybody who's been watching. Next month, my guest will be Sarah Yao, an executive and leadership coach. She's written a book on presence, and I look forward to discussing the spiritual principles behind the human experience with her. So thanks so much, Craig. Thank you. Craig, is there anything, you haven't had a lot of airtime today, is there anything you'd like to say as we wrap up?
This was my sneaky way of getting Zach out and introduced to, I'm much more visible in the three principles world around the world than Zach is, and I think the lid was blown off today, and he's going to be out there more because he has a lot to share, doesn't he?
Great, he does. Thank you, Zach, so much. It's been great to see everybody.
Thanks, Molly.
Thank you, folks. See you same time next week.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.